Part of what makes all of this worth it, what makes all of this kind of drawing and planning worth it, is that you just get to come up with such cool, enjoyable, and sometimes goofy things. In my fantasy world, I've got a whole bunch of forests, and they were all part of this gigantic forest at one point that has kind of fallen into not really disrepair, but essentially it was magical at one point. And then when magic was pulled from the world because, mortals couldn't handle it and didn't do a good job of stewarding magic, big surprise there. The giant forest started to fall apart. And whenever I'm designing something, I generally start from the real world and how things in the real world kind of function. I feel like that's a good benchmark, good place to start. But then pretty quickly I start modifying things really heavily and thinking about really what could happen here? What would make some amount of sense? And I think that's actually like the biggest question that I ask myself with world building is what could happen? There are a lot of things in fantasy worlds and in science fiction that we see in video games and movies and such where we go, yeah, like that's cool here, but that could never really exist. And yet if you went and like really analyzed all the crazy creatures and animals and things that live on our planet and you ran them past somebody who only had a real cursory, like elementary school understanding of biology, there are a lot of things on this planet that people would just go, yeah, no, that doesn't exist. There are no creatures on this planet that can survive temperatures above boiling water. There are no creatures on this planet that can run on water. There are no creatures in this planet that just live in the atmosphere. Like, there are no creatures on this planet that live past 200 years. There's just so many things that are so interesting about our world that you don't really have to go that far. So I like to, just kind of a base level, try to figure out, could this potentially exist in our world? And I don't stop there either, because obviously these are fantasy worlds. And if magic exists, how does that affect the creatures and the plants and the environment? Because it probably should affect it in unique ways. If your world is essentially just medieval Europe, but with dragons, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unless, you write it specifically that way so that it makes sense. If you look at Tolkien's worlds, the way that he put things together, it makes sense primarily because he was trying to create a history that existed in our own history. People will often ask, say things about like, well, is Frodo supposed to be a Jesus analog, or is, Gandalf supposed to be a Jesus analog? It's like, no, there is no need for a Jesus analog in his story because Jesus exists in Middle-earth. He just comes, many ages later. And that's kind of how that system is built. But asking yourself what would work. Can this function? Is there something in real life that exists that's close to this? Is often just a really good place to start. Well, why am I talking about that now? Because I started talking about these cool forests that I have. And it's the fact that on our world we have crazy things in the forests. The big forests like the Amazon and whatnot are just absolutely nuts. Like, you could spend your whole lifetime from afar studying all the things and you would never have even a basic understanding of all of the nuances, there we go. Sometimes words are hard to pronounce when you're trying to do 6 things at once. And it's just an extraordinarily complicated ecosystem, and the stuff that is there is just ridiculous. But the thing is, these are fantasy worlds, so you can find the most ridiculous stuff that exists on our planet. And then you can pull it even further. Because if you can have bacteria that can live in thermal vents, if you can have lobsters and stuff that exist so far under the ocean's surface that they never encounter sunlight and they survive in ludicrous temperatures, that means that thing can exist. And then you can play with that idea and try to figure out how far can you pull that, still staying in the realm of reality, long before you get to the crazy of, okay, well, but what if magic? The second you start pulling magic in, you can really stretch the boundaries of what is believable and what makes sense. And I think it's always good to start from a place that kind of makes sense, because psychologically we're looking for that as humans. And I think really at the end of the day, it's just going to make your life easier. You're going to have fewer questions and things to solve later. It's part of the reason that when I am building a cuisine in my fantasy world, I always kind of start with stuff that we understand and know. But then there'll usually be one or two ingredients that are riffing off of something, a kind of potato that only exists in my world, or an herb, that is similar to cinnamon or something. But sometimes they'll just be things that are like not explained at all. Like there's just a name of a melon that we just don't have that. I guess that's still like a melon. But again, I could go and just come up with all kinds of random things that are not linked to anything else. And if I do that, it's going to be confusing for the reader, and it's going to be kind of hubris and arrogance on my part. So that's kind of pointless. I want to give a reader the chance to potentially feel like they have an understanding of the things that I'm mentioning and talking about. So anyway, that all comes back to this forest. I am so rambly, sorry. It has been a very long day. But that all comes back to this forest, and I wanted to riff off of a couple things in particular. It's a crazy dark forest at the bottom where like basically no sun reaches. So we've got things that exist almost in a perpetual nocturnal cycle. There are lots of plants that have essentially been marooned down there, and I had to start thinking about, well, how are these plants going to exist in this space when essentially like they're not going to be able to get sunlight to photosynthesize? And there is a couple different kinds of, or I guess there are a couple different kinds of plants on our world that exist in similar environments where they can't get enough nutrients from the soil or where they can't get enough to photosynthesize in a normal way. And the one that I decided to play with are plants that are carnivorous. And so I was thinking about, what if you had plants that originally would have just lived in a normal environment, but now they live in an incredibly dark forest? What would be some of the adaptations that they would make in order to exist in that space? And so I came up with some of these, and obviously these are my first sketches, so they're riffing off of things that we know. Maybe they're a little bit playful, but it's fantasy. Sometimes you got to go with some things that are interesting and fun. So I've got this guy that I've just called the bear trap, and it looks a lot like a piranha plant from Mario, which I'm totally cool with. The idea just being that these are mouths that are able to eat things. Maybe they're kind of like fly traps and they open up, and then there's triggers that allow them to close. Maybe they open really, really wide. Be kind of fun. What if you had them? Do I have a space in here to sketch this out? What if you had they open really wide like this, and maybe there's something in the center that is tantalizing for prey to grab onto? So yeah, maybe you have something like this, where the mouth is open and then the neck kind of bit goes that way. This is the grass. And there's something here worth grabbing onto, almost like a tongue, but obviously it's not a tongue because it's a plant. But you could easily have something like this. And maybe that's how they lure things in. I haven't gone through and figured all of that out yet. I will at some point because I enjoy those things. But the idea is that it still has leaves. Maybe they're vestigial, there's no reason for them anymore, but it still has them. This is kind of the idea of a colossal pitcher plant, one that's actually not able to hold itself vertically anymore or hang from something, so it just exists on the ground. And then the little portion that usually exists as almost a lid at the top has become gigantic and almost closes it. And then you could actually have different kinds of scents and maybe substances that are inside of this that draw creatures in. And so there are certain animals that are kind of pulled in out of curiosity or because they're hungry. And maybe this lid closes. Maybe, it floods itself with gastric liquids and digests whatever's in there. I'm not 100% sure yet. Maybe there's something in there that's almost like sticky webs that holds things in so they can't escape. And I kind of played with some tendrils coming down to, this could be playing off of, I think it's called a sundew, which is another carnivorous plant like that. These are actually the same thing. The dark hole flower, which I'm calling an abyssal dandelion because why not? So on the surface, it just looks like this. It just kind of looks like a hole, and there's this thing that comes up to attract prey, and then just a, sarlacc pit kind of mouth structure, which I think is really cool. And I actually really like how this came out, where you almost have like this massive mouth, and then there's almost like a tuber, and the roots are still going out to both anchor it and to give it some additional nutrients. And I kind of like the idea of like leaves still exist, but they almost either are serving different purposes like they are here, or they're just like vestigial. They're not that important anymore. They just exist because they're an evolutionary component that existed at a certain point and made sense, and now they're just there because they're there. These ones that I've been drawing at the beginning of this session are going to be called rain melons. These giant colossal trees, which you can kind of see here, these really crazy colossal trees that make up the forest, are called rain trees. And so the idea here is that this is a plant that actually grows in the canopy of the tree. And then it sends its fruit through these tendrils all the way to the base of the forest. And it produces these melons. And then the melons are eaten by any of the creatures that exist on the forest floor, and then obviously deposited in their droppings. And then I kind of like the idea of they sprout, and they're almost like beans on steroids. Like they're crazy, where they will just attach themselves to the nearest thing and climb. And essentially, they are just climbing up to the top so that they can photosynthesize, and then they put in new roots up in the canopy, and they grow there. And then when they reproduce, they send tendrils back down, or they keep the initial roots that they grew from, and that's where they grow their melons. So this has been really fun so far, just thinking about all of these different kind of techniques for how plants and animals would exist in this environment. It's one of the most enjoyable things about world building, is just how far can you pull things and still have them be rational. This was the first drawing of a creature that exists down here. I call it a fungal auric. And as of right now, it's just kind of riffing off of a sloth, like a pretty slow-moving creature that actually is in some kind of symbiotic relationship with the fungi here. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to go. I'll play with it some more. And this is just, it's been fun. We'll see how all of this works out. I'm kind of excited to draw the rest of this guy and how it works up in the canopy, because obviously, like, you're going to have... Well, actually, yeah, I've done some of the initial drawings over here. But the idea is, you got the side of the tree and then a branch that comes off, perhaps, and maybe it continues to terminate down that way. But these vines kind of creep up here. And then you've got the plant that does its thing. Who knows what the foliage is going to look like. Diversifying foliage is rather difficult, I find at least. There's so many different plants on this planet that, even just having a cursory knowledge of all of them would be really, really impressive. I certainly love plants. I keep a lot here at the house. The room that we kind of don't use much, but is like a pseudo workout room, is where I have all my plants now. It kind of always smells goofy in there because there's so many different things. But I've got little hibiscus cuttings and little fig cuttings. I've got 2 fig trees in there, and a couple different kinds of succulents, and a spider plant that my sister-in-law gave us that my cat tried to eat, and slowly I'm kind of rejuvenating that. But I love plants. They are a very undervalued part of life in general, but certainly part of world building. The plants tell you a lot. I'm rereading Lord of the Rings again, and I'm just always surprised how many plants Tolkien mentions. He mentions herbs and things that are eaten, things that are in teas, things that are steeped for the wound that Frodo gets. The lembas is wrapped in the malorn leaves. The lembas itself is basically made from corn, like celestial corn. But there's just so many plants mentioned, so many flowers, so many different kinds of and specific kinds of trees. And it's really important because our world is full of these things. And, back in the day, they would have been things that you would have been forced to deal with and see. A lot of us now exist in a world where we are kind of divorced from the natural world, but I actually think that's a huge portion of why we like things like fantasy, is because fantasy is kind of intrinsically linked to the natural world. And if you live in a city or if you live in a subdivision where you don't have any trees you can climb and you don't have any forests you can explore, it's kind of fun to read about those kind of crazy things in fantasy novels. And it's kind of cool that we have that opportunity now. There would have been a day and an age where that would have been harder. But I guess books have existed for a while, haven't they? Maybe we're just not that different. Sometimes I have the thought that, things are ridiculously different today from where they were hundreds of years ago. And in some ways, they really, really are. And in some ways, they're really not, because, humanity is humanity. I don't know that I think that we're worse now than, we were in the past. I think that humans just have their tendencies, and those tendencies don't seem to shift and change much over time. People don't really change as a whole. I mean, obviously individuals do, but I don't think that humanity changes that much. We yearn for the natural world in a way where we don't even really understand it or know it all the time, but it's certainly a component of our existence. But that's something that really pulls me into the world building, is just trees and natural forms. You can see these trees I worked with on a couple sessions back. I worked a little bit more on those. I've been enjoying all this stuff with Hyoku, with all the forests, with all their forest dwellings. There's so many things to think about when it comes to all this. And a long, long time ago, I actually worked on these guys, because at the base of Hyoku, there are plants that are essentially alive, which makes sense. They are probably the ones that developed in the roots of this giant forest and then eventually kind of migrated themselves out of there. Plants being able to migrate, which I guess they do, but it's not like the same way birds do. But I love this idea of there's walking plants introduced in the first novel when they go by this space. And then in the third novel, where we are right now, they're seeing the rumors not of the plants necessarily, but of the crazy animals that live down there. Because that's the other thing, is that there are giant beasts that live in that forest. It's ludicrously inhospitable. And again, the funny part here is that doesn't really come up in the books. At least not where I am right now. I'm not in a space where those are things that I'm dealing with. My characters are not running into those things right now. They're ancillary facts about the world. And that's part of world building. Be it good or bad or otherwise, there's just a lot of things that are, they're extraneous. I was thinking about this the other day, actually, and the fact that there is so much in world building that is just kind of pointless from a particular point of view. Obviously it can have a point in that it's fun to craft. It can be really enjoyable to work with the things, but it's largely doesn't necessarily need to be there. It's a part of the process that is really extraneous. And I've also been trying to think recently too about, if you were going to start world building from absolute scratch, where would you start? I've actually probably talked about this a couple times on these episodes, and it's something that exists in the back of my head rent-free, as the kids would say. It's something that I am really aware of, that I can do this pretty naturally because my brain is just always working in the background with things, and it makes me curious, how can I help other people learn how to world build? And I think at a basic level, you have to be curious. You have to have a desire to understand how things work and how things function. If you're doing it just because your story or your novel or whatever it is that you want to work on requires it, then it's obviously going to feel like work, because in that scenario it is work. It's not something that you want to do because it's an act of love. It's something that you want to do because it needs to be done. And I mean, that's what work is, right? Most of us work jobs that are not what we want to be doing, but they're things that pay us, and so they have some other extraneous benefit that is good for us in some way. So I guess, if you're world building because you feel like you should, maybe take another look at things, because it's a lot of work. I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's healthy for any story or world that you might be working on. But I also think it's good for artists in general. But if you are dedicated to a story and you find yourself there and you don't want to be there, take a couple steps back. J.K. Rowling, when she built the first Harry Potter book, there's a lot of world building like real early on in that book, and it's actually done pretty masterfully. But the world building is pretty shoddy when you think about it for the entirety of the series in how it's laid out in that first novel. Because in that first novel, she did not know what it was going to become, obviously. And I don't think she had the plan necessarily to go as far as she ended up going later. I could, of course, be wrong, but that's my understanding from my research and from all the stuff that I bumped into over the years. And it really makes a lot of sense because things are not particularly consistent from novel to novel. They're consistent inside of the novel. She does a really good job of that. But, you can't compare with Tolkien. And I think the problem is a lot of people feel like they need to. And if you want to do what Tolkien did, you've got to be willing to dedicate the time that Tolkien did. And that's basically impossible. There are ways that you can get around it, I'm sure. Especially nowadays, if you were willing to use AI to do those things. But if you're going to use AI to do a lot of your world building, then I think that probably brings up some other questions too. AI is so, fraught with so many things right now. It's so difficult. It's one of those things that, in some capacities, it can be a lovely tool. In others, it's just parasitizing, artists and creatives. And it also seems to be really different depending on which realm you're working in. If you are working in the corporate world and, it can help you create copy and text for emails and blogs and things like that really quickly, then that seems like that might be fundamentally different than, if you're using it to make art. And then you've got to dissect, is world building art in the same way that writing a novel is art? Those are complicated questions. Pieces of it, for sure. All of it, I don't know. Where are the philosophers? We need philosophers to help us out with this junk. Life is complicated and hard. And that piece of, I think, our life is getting harder as time goes on. But I guess all of this comes back to, how do you really start world building? Because that's where I got onto this kind of portion of the topic is how do you really just start world building from scratch? And it's hard. I think ecosystems are a good place to start. Tolkien would tell you a map. A map is the only sensible way to start. I think that, I don't remember the exact quote, but he says that at some point where he's when I started my process, I started with a map in the only reasonable way. Something, I'm very much paraphrasing, but it was something very much like that. A map is the logical place to start. And I think that's probably true. Start with a map. Doesn't have to be perfect. Doesn't have to be something you stick with, intensely later on, but a map's a good place to start. And then I think start with some basic elements as far as, where are there going to be cities and things like that and ecosystems. You don't have to go quite as crazy as I have at certain points and actually build out the weather patterns for the planet. I don't think it's a bad idea. I think that it can be really helpful to know where things go. But I think probably the next thing, or maybe even preceding these things, is figuring out what you want to do. What kind of story do you want to tell? What kind of stuff do you want to work with? Because it's really going to be a labor of love. So make sure it's got components in it that you are going to enjoy and find pleasurable and fun. I like castles. I like towers. I like, those are the things that I really enjoyed when I was younger. And so that's a lot of the stuff that I started with when I started doing a lot of my drawings. And a lot of my early world building was I want to have a cool dark tower like Barad-dûr. And so I just spent a lot of time drawing towers. And then after I drew the tower, I was well, what would the other architecture that this people group built look like? And then I started playing with those things. And it kind of went out from there. And I don't think there's anything wrong with approaching it that kind of way. where it's just, I want to make this cool thing. I want to, another thing that I wanted to do, and this is probably something that's going to occur to some of you as well. It's like, I want to have really cool magical swords. And so then it's like, okay, well, let's design a bunch of really cool magical swords. And then from there, we have to figure out, well, what kind of people would make these swords? How would they be built? How would they fit into that culture? Would they be something that's handed down, father to son, or father to firstborn, or father to most, relevant, or mother to most relevant, or however your culture wants to be? Immediately from having just a single thing like that, that's kind of, this is cool and I want to work with it, you can start getting into ideas of how are you going to unpack things? How are you going to make things make sense in that particular realm? And I've had a lot of luck basically just doing that. Just thinking about how each of the decisions I'm making are going to affect other things. And, I decided that I wanted to have this race of people, for example, these sprites. And in particular, I wanted to have them because I didn't want to have elves. Because when I started building this, I was, I think, 14 years old, and I was, full of hubris, and was like, I'm going to do my own thing. And, I'm not going to lean on any of the tropes, which of course is ridiculous. Like, you're going to lean on the tropes. The tropes are not bad, not by their very nature. And so I started working on, okay, I'm going to have, this is going to be like my elf analog, the elegant, forest dwelling, druidic, hippie people. And then, from that, I design a bunch of stuff, and it becomes like, well, where would they live? How would they eat? How would they grow food? And all of these things just start kind of coming into fruition. But it all kind of, for me, started with, this is cool, I want to play with it. And as I continue to explore and continue to play with things, you get more in depth, you learn more about your culture and your people, you play more, you have more fun. Man, that's probably it, is just design cool things that you would want to see and things that are fun to play with, and you'll stick to it. And I think at the end of the day, like, if you stick to it, you'll eventually make cool things, and it'll be fun and it'll be exciting. And that's really what basically all of this is just make cool crap. I mean, crap's kind of not a great term for that, I suppose, right? But make cool stuff. Make cool things that you would like to see. Pivot off of the stuff that you find exciting. I liked Lord of the Rings. I like Dune. I like a lot of video games. Like, I grew up playing Warcraft. I grew up playing World of Warcraft for a time until I got married and was like, yeah, we're not doing this while I'm trying to also hold down a marriage. And I loved the lore there. I loved the crazy dragon aspects of the Warcraft franchise. And so I played with those ideas, and bits and pieces of that have made it into my own stories. And they've dramatically shifted over time because I've gotten older. And it's fine if your first forays in world building are pretty much just copying the stuff that you liked when you were younger. That's how most art begins. Artists often just copy the stuff that entrances them until you copy enough to start building out on your own and doing things that are quite different than what your predecessors did. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's a very, very natural way to progress. I know that there's a lot of shame that gets thrown around in the art community, and the art community in some ways is much better about that than other communities, but it still has its issues and its sins. And that's one of them, is we have a tendency to harp on people for copying when they're learning, and force people to, come up with an artistic style earlier than they're ready. And the reality is, like, you are going to copy and mimic the things that you find exciting. And if you find them exciting, there's a really good chance that a lot of other people find them exciting too. And if you play with them a lot and you build off of those ideas, you're going to create new, cool, exciting things for the next generation to fall in love with. And that's what we need. I loved those things, and so I try to create my own versions of those things. And if I am very fortunate and remain dedicated to things like I have, hopefully someday I will bring those things to fruition in a way where other people can enjoy them and hopefully be inspired by them. Is that audacious? Yes, absolutely. But you know what? That's fine. Be audacious. Every crazy cool thing that you enjoy in your life is the result of somebody either being crazy lucky or really audacious at some point and going, you know what? I'm going to try to make a movie. I'm going to try to make a video game. I'm going to try to write a book. Like the vast majority of people who do that don't ever succeed, right? But you know what? Everybody who did it succeeded. And they all at some point started with that idea. I wish I could tell you that, if you work hard enough, you can, be famous or bring things to life. I don't know why I'd say that. I wouldn't want to be famous. But bring things to life and like accomplish what you want to. And you know what? Like the piece of that that's true is if you want to build a world, if you want to write a book or tell a story, that is devoid of the need for other people to see it. Like you can write your book. And yes, it would be awesome for it to be published. Of course it would be. But it's still going to be worth writing it. It's still going to be worth making those paintings. It's still going to be worth, putting those things together, even if it doesn't amount to exactly what you want, and if it couldn't. Even if you look at Tolkien, Tolkien didn't set out writing all those languages, which is where everything started for him, with the desire originally for them to be this giant cascade of success. Like when he started writing his novels, there was probably more of that, but that's not where his world building starts. His world building starts with his languages, and then it goes in a lot of different directions, and it was a long time before it started to work its way into the Silmarillion, and then into the Hobbit, and then into the Lord of the Rings. There was always something way further back for him that was what led him to do what he was doing. And you know what? Like, the overwhelming chances are that I am not going to be a Tolkien. I'm not going to have books that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have read. That is the overwhelming likelihood. But you know what? Someone will be. And I think that's enough. I will be satisfied having put the time into these things. I will be happy that my daughter has a legacy in me. There's things that she'll be able to read and pull apart 20, 30, 40 years from now and just make her chuckle and be like, yep, that sounds like a kind of character my dad would write. Those kind of things will be worth it if nothing more comes from it. But there's always the possibility of more. Always the possibility of more, because it happens every single day. Every single day, somebody gets a book deal. A new video game gets greenlit. A new YouTube channel explodes. A new artist gets discovered on Instagram. Somebody gets a full ride scholarship to an art school. Every single day these things happen. And so yes, they're rare, and it's probably not going to happen for you. It's probably not going to happen for me, but it will happen for someone. And even if it doesn't happen for you, it's still worth putting the time into that world, into building things. It'll be satisfying. It'll be exciting. You'll be a better version of you. And you will probably never regret having put the time in. I know I certainly don't. I put a tremendous amount of time into the stuff here on the channel, into all of this world building, into making videos, into writing the books, into my art, and even if I had to turn away from it tomorrow for some reason, I would not regret this time. I am a better person. I'm a better version of me. Just knowing that I can make videos and people will resonate with them, that's wonderful. And especially wonderful after getting out of teaching. And the fact that I know that I can write a book. I don't know if it's good, but I have written a book. That's so cool. It's so good for the self-esteem. So wherever you are with your process, whatever you are world building or thinking about world building or dream about world building, please, please, please keep going. Because someone is going to be the next success story that excites the next generation. And it might not be you, and it might not be me, it might not be anybody who's listening to this, but it will be someone. And even if it's not you, the world building is still going to be a good thing for you. Well, as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to me and my rambles. I hope there was some benefit somewhere in it. I would love to hear from you just about which piece of what I said you resonate with the most. And also, like, let me know where you feel like, you know, I like your videos, Zach, but that was very off base this time. Like, I need to know that too. It's a good thing. You know, a lot of this is just opinion. It's also good to know, like, if I was wrong about something, because it happens. Only human over here. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. The Patreon link is in the description down below. It is right next to the Discord link, which I would highly recommend you checking out. All right, well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.